This is episode 634 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Isaac Orr. He is vice president of research at Always On Research, and he used to work at the Center of the American Experiment, which is a Minnesota-based free market think tank as well. So we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about Minnesota's governor, or I guess former governor. Well, he's running for vice president right now. But anyway, Isaac, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Hey, Paul, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, before we get to any Minnesota-related items, we recently worked together with you and Always On Research to try to get to the bottom of some data relating to New Mexico's clean fuel standard, which passed the legislature in 2024, HB 41. And I guess you've done some work on these policies in the past. Talk about, first and foremost, what is a clean fuel standard and where have these things been enacted? And then we can talk a little bit about your findings. But uh, this clean fuel standard idea, taking the carbon out of fuel, seems a little far-fetched to me. Does it work, I guess, as a starting point?
Yeah, happy to talk about this. So the clean fuel standard, as it's called in New Mexico, as it's been proposed in Minnesota, is really just a derivative of the low carbon fuel standard that was implemented in California about 10 years ago. So the purpose of this is essentially a complex cap and trade system on transportation fuels designed to lower the carbon intensity of all of the fuel that's used in the fleet. And the way that they calculate this is they say, okay, well, if you're going to actually sell electricity to charge electric vehicles, that has a lower carbon intensity than gasoline or diesel fuel. So therefore, you're serving to reduce the fleet-wide average of the carbon intensity. And mandates like the ones proposed in Minnesota, the ones enacted in New Mexico, generally say we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the fuel supply by 20% by a certain date. In a lot of cases, it's 2030 or 40% by 2030. So, or yeah, that's correct. So the key characteristic is you can either comply with these mandates by blending lower carbon fuels into your fuel supply. So that could be ethanol in some areas, but ethanol is kind of on the outs in terms of its favorability with environmentalists. You could use renewable diesel, which is generated from plant oils or used like restaurant oils, and that has a lower carbon intensity score than diesel fuel. Plus, it's a one-for-one replacement of it. Or you have to buy credits from people that do generate the lower carbon fuels or sell the lower carbon fuels. So, like I said, it's a complex cap and trade system. It adds costs, and ultimately, those costs will be borne by consumers.
Okay, so there are four, is it four states? How many states have embarked upon
Yeah.
this policy?
Yeah, so you have California, Oregon, Washington, and now New Mexico. But similar policies are also being considered in Minnesota and Michigan.
Ah, Minnesota. There you go, your home state.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The proposal that was debated in the legislature this last session in Minnesota was actually the most aggressive low carbon fuel standard proposed in the country. It was more aggressive than what California had on its books at that time. So the costs were going to be much larger. And in committee, Senator Scott Dibble, who was the senator in Minnesota who proposed this legislation, basically said, this is an effort to electrify the entire vehicle fleet and get rid of biofuels. So he was really trying to, I don't know, assuage the fears of groups like the Sierra Club that said, well, this is just a bailout for corn ethanol and industrial agriculture. So they said the quiet part out loud, which was great for that committee hearing. I wasn't expecting them to be that honest, but they were. So yeah, this is a policy that Started on the West Coast, but it's now moving its way inward.
Okay, so that helps me answer one of my questions for you, which is, we're in New Mexico, one of the states. I believe a dozen or so have followed California down the path of mandating electric vehicles, and that's for a variety of reasons. That's kind of a one size fits all policy where we have to basically go in lockstep with California. Is Minnesota on that track as well? I assume Walls, with his hard left policies, is probably doing that too.
Yes, so Minnesota adopted the first phase of the California zero emission vehicle policy. So he did not adopt the one that says we're going to ban the sale of new internal combustion engines by 2035. Walls is left, but he's also savvy and he tries to get what he can and understands where, the Biden administration was already going to be, imposing these EV mandates, essentially forcing 66% of new cars to be electric by 2032. So this year in Minnesota, auto dealers are required to stock about 14,000 electric vehicles on their lots throughout the state. So we do have some EV mandates, but not the most extreme mandates that have been adopted in several other states.
Okay, so I was wondering, this interesting to see this policy crosshatched, if you will, with the EV mandates. Now, of course, the EV mandates didn't require legislative approval, at least here in New Mexico, and I know California. They have unelected boards doing this in Minnesota. I assume it's the same thing for EV mandates, but the clean fuel standard did require going through the legislature. That's kind of commonplace, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, so we have New Mexico now joining Washington, Oregon, California as the states that have these clean fuel standards. So getting back to, and again, you can read the policy brief at riograndefoundation.org, heirsofenchantment.com. The study is it's a brief 5-pager, finds New Mexico clean fuel standard will dramatically raise fuel prices. Now, before we get to how you figure that out, uh, there is diversity, I guess, within these various mandates. And you ultimately, for our paper, chose Oregon. Why did you choose Oregon as the model, or the way that this was going to be analyzed?
Yeah, we used Oregon because Oregon does not have its own separate carbon tax, and Washington and Oregon do, or sorry, Washington and California do. So when you're looking at the cost of the credits for the low carbon fuel standard program, clean fuel standard program, whatever you want to call it, the credit prices in Washington and California, or in California and Washington, are influenced by that carbon tax as well. So we wanted to make the most apples to apples comparison possible between states, which is why we use Oregon if the state that we're modeling this policy for do not have their own separate carbon tax.
Okay. So one other question related to that is, uh, these other states that have had this policy on the book for a little while, uh, you mentioned credits. You also mentioned actual reformulation of the uh, fuels, because that's gasoline and diesel. In the states that have done this, is it mostly uh, a cap and trade kind of mechanism, or are we actually going to see uh, more, carbon neutral or carbon reduced fuel in our gas tanks, or is this a both kind of thing? And if so, there are real issues with ethanol. I don't know where New Mexico is going to go with this whole thing, but um, I guess just as a person who uses a gasoline powered vehicle, am I going to experience negative results from having this new form of fuel in my gas tank? Because I know ethanol is something that a lot of people are concerned about in the terms of the impact on gas mileage and the integrity of the engines.
Yeah, so ethanol has about 33% less energy per volume than gasoline, so you do get worse gas mileage as you blend more ethanol into your tank. That's just kind of a standard thing. Most cars that were made before, I believe it was 2001, were able to use about 10% ethanol in their engines, but they called it the blend wall because beyond that, you weren't really able to safely blend more ethanol into the fuel supply. Now we're getting to the point to where new cars are able to handle about 15 to 20% ethanol in the fuel supply without causing undue stress on the engine. But that's also another blend wall. And you would need to have like an E85 vehicle, which is 85% ethanol. It's a special engine that you make in order to go higher than that. And the other thing that a lot of times policymakers don't think about is the equipment that you use for pumping stations for E85 is different than the pumping equipment that you use for gasoline blends with lower amounts of ethanol in them. So you have a significant amount of infrastructure that is already in place that would have to be replaced in order to accommodate higher blends of ethanol, which the way that the CI score, its carbon intensity score, is calculated, there are changes proposed that would reduce the benefits of ethanol in terms of its greenhouse gas reductions too. So if you're a gas station owner, are you going to spend maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to essentially retrofit your operation in order to accommodate a fuel that may not be in the good graces of the legislation 4 or 5 years from now? I think that that's really a big question mark. And I personally, I wouldn't spend that kind of money if I thought that was going to be the case.
Wow, this stuff is arcane and very complicated. So just
Yes, it is.
thank you for shedding some light on all this because it's fairly simple to understand buy EVs or else, as in the EV mandate. But when you get into all of this stuff relating to fuel and what kind of fuel is being used, it gets very, very complicated. So you may or may not know, New Mexico has not formally uh, gone, the policy has not been implemented at this point. It is supposedly going to be uh, started spring of 2025. Uh, if people or when people go to the gas station as this is being implemented, will they automatically be able to tell this is happening? Will they be able to choose? Because there are some gas stations here that sell zero ethanol gasoline. Is this something that you can choose the gas station that you prefer with the fuel you prefer, or is it sounds like there's going to be some level of choice, and that it's not going to be it's not going to be just forced down every gas station's throat, so to speak.
Yeah, you'll still be able to get your ethanol-free gasoline, which is especially important for small engines, boats, that sort of stuff. I always buy no ethanol gasoline, which is much more difficult to find in Minnesota, surprise, surprise, a big corn state, than
Mhm.
probably in New Mexico. But if they sell that gasoline, they're going to have to offset more credits, right? So they're going to accumulate. The way that the low carbon fuel standard works is the government sets a baseline for how much CO2 can be emitted as part of the fuel supply. And if you're selling fuel that's over that limit, you generate a deficit or a demerit, and you need to offset that by purchasing a credit. And that's what the credit price is all about. So if you are selling these higher carbon intensity score gasoline products, then you're going to have to spend more money on these credits, which is going to get passed through to consumers at the pump. So you will see a price increase as a result of that. And in 2025, the modeling that we did for you all shows that it's going to increase the cost of gasoline by about 5 cents a gallon. So that's, the price of gasoline can move, 5, 6 cents a gallon based on geopolitical factors very easily. So
Mhm.
it won't be immediately obvious, but as the regulations become more stringent over time, that initial price increase is going to compound.
Okay, but I guess what I'm asking, in addition, is there going to be a different functionality of the gas pump, or will will people be able to tell, like, the week before you were using a different gas pump or some mechanism versus after this is started to be implemented, or is it going to kind of be silent and you're just not going to be any wiser about it?
I think you probably won't be any wiser about it. In Minnesota, we already have to blend 10% of the fuel supply with ethanol, and there's also a biodiesel mandate already. So some of these things are just going to depend on, in New Mexico, do you have 10% ethanol already at your gas stations? And if you do, then you probably won't notice anything. But if the gas station exclusively sells non-blended ethanol or gasoline with ethanol, then you might actually see a change at the gas pump where, they're going to have stickers on the pump that says, 10% ethanol in this blend. They're going to change the octane level and things of that nature. So you'll just have to be on the lookout for that.
Okay, got it. Now let's get to the findings of the paper itself. You mentioned prices going up. So this does you mentioned it is going to take some time to fully implement. Why is that, and what is the result of that in terms of pricing?
Yeah, it takes a while to ramp up the cost of this because the initial standards that are generally set. So let's say you have a baseline of 100 carbon intensity. So it's generally grams per megajoule, but like we don't need to. Let's just think of it as units, right? So you have 100 units as your baseline. And maybe the first year you only have to reduce the carbon intensity of your fuel supply by 2 units. And then the next year you have to reduce it by 4 units, 6 units, 8 units, and so on. So the amount of CO2 emissions that you're supposed to offset grow every single year. And that means you have to purchase more credits if you're not blending those lower carbon fuels into your supply. And those credits come at a cost. And in Oregon last year, they were about $130 a credit. So, and each credit is equivalent to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. So as you're basically forcing the fuel supply to decarbonize to a greater extent over time, the cost of compliance with the program increases.
Right. And you cite by 2030, 30 cents a gallon gasoline price increase, and that'll be 34.7 for diesel by 2040, 45 cents per gallon, and 52 cents for diesel. So uh, pretty significant increases there uh, just for this regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's real money. I mean, we calculated the average fuel consumption for New Mexico households, and we found that for gasoline in 2030, the average family is going to be paying an additional $340 for gasoline, and by 2040, it'll be an additional $510. And diesel, very similar story, $327 per household, based on 2022 fuel consumption and number of households in New Mexico. And by 2040, it would be $490 per family. And the one thing I want to stress to people listening that diesel fuel is primarily used for trucking, heavy industry, and getting stuff from point A to point B. Farming is a big thing. So the increase in diesel costs won't probably affect as many people because most people drive gasoline powered cars. But that increase in cost for diesel is going to show up at the grocery store and everywhere else.
Um, so I guess just kind of to conclude this component of our conversation, uh, it almost seems to me that this is a effort to try to reduce the attractiveness of gasoline and diesel powered vehicles relative to electric vehicles because uh, it's convoluted, it's going to be expensive. Yeah, it looks like compliance is going to be expensive, the tax credits. It's just a lot of stuff to deal with. And we know that most politicians on the left side of the political spectrum don't really care much for gas-powered vehicles to begin with. They don't care how much the stuff you buy at the store costs. So they're more than happy to force these costs onto you in search of their green dreams. It just seems to me that this is yet another effort to cram electric vehicles, including electric semi trucks, down our throats. Am I being overly cynical here? Please
I
tell
don't
me
know
I'm
if you're
being
being
overly
cynical
cynical.
enough, Paul.
Okay.
I mean, I grew up on a farm. You're never going to find more cynical people than farmers.
All right.
The thing about it is this extra cost that people are paying at the pump, it goes to profits for, companies that have electric vehicle charging stations. So it's really a wealth transfer from families that drive internal combustion engine vehicles to families that drive electric vehicles. None of this extra money goes to roads and bridges, which is, people are not happy about increases in the gas taxes, but at least they feel like, okay, if this fixes my road or the potholes in my neighborhood, I'm going to be more okay with it. And that's not where this money goes. It is just it's a wealth transfer, as we spoke about before. So yeah, it is an attempt to decrease the attractiveness of internal combustion vehicles relative to electric vehicles. Absolutely. And the folks in Minnesota were saying that very brazenly. I think that it's pretty safe to say that that is the prevailing thought on the left for especially the very progressive politicians.
Right. Okay, so let's go ahead and tackle your governor, Tim Walz. Now, before we get down this path too much, Tim Walz and Michelle Lujan Grisham, our governor, seem quite similar in a lot of ways. They both were elected for the first time in 2018. They both have kind of embraced the same political playbook, including energy, although New Mexico is a much bigger energy producing state, oil and gas state, than Minnesota is. It just is striking how policies implemented in these states kind of are interchangeable in a lot of respects. And your focus, I know, is energy, but I would love to hear kind of just your broader thoughts about Tim Walz and his actions as governor of Minnesota.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Energy is my strong suit. So when I talk about other issues, I get over my skis a little bit. But Minnesota enacted very aggressive paid family medical leave legislation that I've talked to a whole bunch of business owners, and they say, uh, like, this is going to be very difficult for small businesses to stomach. And it also, it basically allows employees to like take off like one timed hour or something of that nature. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this, but
Mhm.
basically it allowed employees to take time off for a variety of reasons that the employer like didn't have any say over. So employers are worried about that because they can't actually get people to show up to work without fearing like a lawsuit or something of that nature. There was the riots in 2020 that, have come under increased scrutiny as a result of like, did he send in the National Guard soon enough? I lived in Minneapolis during that time, so that was a very surreal experience. I lived in South Minneapolis for a few years, and like the grocery store, the Target, and like those places that I went to get my groceries and get stuff, they got looted and burned down. So that was crazy. There were a lot of helicopters flying over, and like the Walgreens down the street from me got looted and burned. So people that needed to get prescriptions and stuff like that. I think there was a lot of controversy over that. We also had a policy during COVID that sent elderly people that had had the virus back to the nursing homes that they came from, which is not a good policy when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable from the virus. But overall, it's been a lot of progressive policies that have been enacted, and I'm happy to jump into more of the energy stuff here, but there has been a wish list of far left policies that have gotten enacted, especially after 2022, when the Democrats won control of the House of Representatives and the state Senate.
Yeah, the paid family leave thing is another item that's been on our governor's agenda for a few years now. So it's really quite shocking when you look at just the parallels there between the policies. And of course, the clean fuel standard and the EV mandates are both related to energy. We've already talked about those. Uh, how, just talk about other energy policies or anything that jumps out at you as really defining Tim Walz and his. Yeah, do you guys have oil and gas up there? Did he attack that industry in any direct fashion, or is it pretty much uh, irrelevant to Minnesota's economy?
Yeah, we don't have any oil or gas deposits in the state, but we do have the world's largest undeveloped deposits of copper and nickel
Uh
in the
huh.
world. But that was the Biden administration came in and pulled the permits for one of those large mining facilities, and then they also canceled a critical water permit for the other one. So it was federal action that kind of prevented us from developing our natural resources, which would have created something along the lines of 14,000 new jobs on the Iron Range in Minnesota, which is where Bob Dylan is from, which is why people are sometimes familiar with that. But Governor Walz basically hasn't seen a California energy policy that he has not tried to implement in the state. When he was campaigning for governor, he said he wanted to have a modest increase in the gas tax. He gets elected. He says, okay, well, it's actually a 20-cent increase in the gas tax, which would have been a 70% increase and made us the fourth highest gas tax in the country. So there's been a long established pattern of Governor Walz saying he wants to do something that's modest or moderate. And then once he has an opportunity to lurch further to the progressive wing of his party, he does that. So we had this with the oil pipeline too. So Minnesota doesn't have its own oil and natural gas, so we have to import it. And we have the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, which brings in crude oil from Alberta, Canada. And the pipeline was operating at one half of its potential capacity due to corrosion issues. They couldn't pressurize it to the full extent. And when he was campaigning for office, he said, you know, the Public Utilities Commission looked at this. They have studied it for 4 years. They said it's okay. We should move forward with this project. And then when he was elected, he decided, well, no, actually, we need to review this some more. He said, you know, there's the science, there's the data, and then there's also the need for a social permit or social license in order to have this project go through. And, you know, on the campaign trail, he said, when it comes to mining, I'm going to follow the science. When it comes to the pipeline, I'm going to follow the science. And injecting a non-quantitative criteria, such as a social license, is the exact opposite of following the science. And it actually made the pipeline less safe to operate. So I would argue that he was endangering the environment by doing that. But at one point, his Commerce Department argued that Minnesota wouldn't need the oil because of electric vehicles and things of that nature. And that looked incredibly short-sighted when Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices spiked because once Line 3 was operating at its full capacity, a judge finally said that the company could go through and complete the pipeline. It was importing more oil into the United States than we were importing from Russia. So it's a major conduit for crude oil in the U.S. And lastly, I think I would hit on, and you have this in New Mexico as well, a 100% carbon-free electricity mandate. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so and it's interesting, the legislation in Minnesota that established this mandate did not lift the state's moratorium on building new nuclear power plants. So it essentially made Minnesota a 100% wind, solar, and battery storage uh, state. And the problem with replacing a reliable coal or natural gas plant with wind and solar is that it isn't reliable. You can't turn it on. So when I was at Center of the American Experiment, Mitch Rolling and I did a report. We analyzed the reliability and cost impacts of that policy, and we found that it would cause a 55-hour blackout in January of
Mm,
2040. And that's not good in Minnesota. Like it gets
right.
cold in New Mexico, I'm sure, but the if it gets to 10 degrees in January in Minnesota, we consider that a warm spell. And then it was going to cost a lot of money. It was going to cost $1,600 per year for residential consumers and industrial consumers like the iron mines and the paper mills and the manufacturers. They were going to see something along the lines of $250,000 a year in additional electricity costs. So that is already something the state is struggling with. We have the highest industrial electricity prices in the Great Lakes region, with the exception of New York. So manufacturers are looking elsewhere.
So I am interested in finding out a little bit more about your electricity generation plans. I mean, New Mexico, we are obviously much to the south of you, which means, and with blue skies and sunny weather, solar is definitely considered a energy option for the clean fuel approach to things. We have obviously have a lot of wind as well. I assume that your focus is on wind there in Minnesota, but uh, I can only imagine that also politicians, they just can't get enough of solar, even though you guys are very different climate up there, especially in the wintertime with very limited sun. So with the nuclear moratorium, and then that really leaves you at wind and solar. What are they doing for electricity in in Minnesota?
They're building a lot of wind and solar. Solar
Okay.
is probably one of the fastest growing sources of electricity in the state right now. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The best wind resources are actually in North and South Dakota. And a lot of the transmission system in our region of the country is already congested, and it's more difficult to permit the wind and get the electricity from, the Great Plains to Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the power is going to be produced, and you can locate solar closer to the places that consume the power. So we have a large coal plant in Minnesota. It's called the Sherburne County Generating Station. A lot of people abbreviate that to Sherco. And they're building a huge solar facility there to reuse the interconnection from the coal plant. So the problem is solar only works well in the summertime here. And in February and December, or sorry, December and January, solar works about 5% of its potential output. It produces about 5% of its potential output in the winter time. And if it snows the day before you have a wind drought, then we're going to be pretty lean times here in terms of grid reliability. So I think it's kind of a question of when blackouts occur as a result of this over reliance on unreliable energy sources as a result of if it happens.
Yeah, that I mean, we get our share of cold weather here in New Mexico uh, in the winter, and that can certainly impact things. But uh, I don't think anyone would argue that New Mexico gets cold weather like Minnesota gets cold weather, and I know that can certainly affect solar. Certainly, the daylight is very limited and very indirect, and you don't have the blue skies year round like we do. And then I imagine those wind turbines don't spin very easily in -20, -30 temperatures. Uh, that's something that
They
I've certainly heard about as well.
Yeah, they actually shut down at -22 to preserve the wind turbine from breaking. So when we need the power the most, which is during a polar vortex, we already know these energy sources will not work. They like the factory spec manual says -22, please shut these down so we don't break them. So they actually become net consumers of electricity on the grid because they have heating elements in the gearboxes to keep the oil from freezing and keep the parts from breaking down. So we're essentially saying we want to gamble with the weather, and also we are going to consume more power than we're producing with these sources when everyone else needs electricity the most.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're getting to the end of our conversation here, Isaac, and I just want to give you a chance to say anything that we didn't talk about, any items that you want to get across to our listeners before we conclude our conversation. You guys got a website there? I know your consultancy is relatively new, so uh, folks want to find out more about you guys. Where do they do that?
Yeah, the website is live, Paul. We
All
finally
right.
got it. We made it. So folks can go to aoenergy.org, and then you'll find the work that we've been doing. We're also on Substack, Mitch Rolling and I at Energy Bad Boys. So just go to energybadboys.substack.com, and that's it. That's where you can find us.
Wow, you really going for that energy, bad boys. I like it.
That's right. Energy policy with an edge. That's what we attempt to deliver every Saturday to the inbox of our readers.
All right, and you can find the policy paper that we worked on with Isaac and his group there. RGF study finds New Mexico's clean fuel standard will dramatically raise fuel prices. That's at Rio Grande Foundation and Heirs of Enchantment. Uh, and This is coming soon. This is not a drill. This has been passed in the legislature, signed by the governor, and it's just a matter of time before it is implemented here in our state. So thank you for your time today, Isaac, and thanks for sharing your knowledge with us, both in the paper itself and here on this show. So uh, look forward to talking to you again, possibly when the next harebrained energy scheme comes up here in New Mexico, which I'm sure it will.
Won't take long. Yeah, happy to be on the show again, Paul. I appreciate being on.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.